In a world where loving her meant breaking every law, he still chose her. The chains around Emily Carter's wrists felt too heavy for someone like her, like they belonged to a different life, a different world, not the one where she spent 10-hour shifts balancing trays and counting tips that barely covered rent. And yet here she was, standing in the center of a hall so vast it could fit a football field, surrounded by figures who didn't breathe the same air as her, didn't live by the same rules, didn't even see her as something equal, only something fragile, temporary, human. The marble beneath her worn shoes gleamed like ice, reflecting chandeliers that cost more than she would make in a lifetime. And every eye in the room was on her, cold, ancient, unreadable, as if they were watching a moment already decided, a story already finished. A human does not stand beside a king. A voice echoed from somewhere above, smooth and sharp like polished steel, and Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry, her heartbeat loud enough she was sure they could all hear it, because she didn't belong here. She had never belonged anywhere like this. Not when just yesterday she was running through rain that soaked through her thrift store jacket, cutting through an alley to save 10 minutes on her walk home. Not when she had stopped because someone was there, slumped against the wall, too still, too quiet. She remembered the way her breath caught, the way instinct pushed her forward even when something felt wrong, because kindness had always been her weakness, the one thing she couldn't turn off, even when the world gave her every reason to, and she had knelt beside him. This stranger in clothes too sharp, too perfect for that broken place, his skin cold in a way that didn't make sense, his eyes closed like he was holding on to something heavy. "Hey," she had whispered, shaking him gently, her fingers brushing his wrist, and for a second, just a second, the air had changed, like the temperature dropped 10 degrees, like the world itself paused. But she ignored it, because people didn't think about impossible things when someone needed help. They just acted. She had taken off her jacket, draped it over his shoulders, stayed there longer than she should have, longer than was safe, until he stirred, until those eyes opened, not normal eyes, not human, something deeper, something older, something that looked straight through her like she was the only thing in existence. "You shouldn't be here," he had said, voice low, controlled, like every word was chosen carefully, and she had almost laughed, because neither should he. But she only shrugged, pulling her sleeves over her hands. Against the cold, "Neither should you," she replied, and that was it. That was the moment everything changed, though she didn't know it then. Didn't know that simple kindness could ripple into something this dangerous, this irreversible. Now the hall felt colder than that alley ever had, the presence around her pressing in from all sides, and she forced herself not to look afraid, even when a figure stepped forward, tall, elegant, eyes glinting with quiet authority. "You broke a law older than this city," the voice declared, and murmurs rippled through the crowd like a storm about to break. Emily's fingers curled slightly against the chains, confusion mixing with fear, because she didn't understand what law, what rule, what line she had crossed just by helping someone who needed it. But she understood one thing clearly as the room shifted, as a path opened through the sea of dark silhouettes, as silence fell again, heavier this time, more expectant. He was here, the man from the alley, but not the same, no longer hidden in shadow and rain, now standing tall beneath the chandeliers, every inch of him radiating something undeniable, something powerful enough to make even the others step back, his pale skin almost glowing against the black of his suit, his gaze locked on her with an intensity that made the world narrow down to just that moment, just that connection. "Lucien Voss," someone whispered, the name carrying weight, recognition, fear, and Emily's stomach dropped. Because she didn't need anyone to explain it, didn't need to be told what that name meant. She could feel it in the way the air shifted, in the way no one dared move, in the way her heart skipped as realization settled in slow and heavy. The man she had helped wasn't just anyone, and whatever she had done, whatever had begun in that alley, it hadn't ended there. It had followed her into this place, into this moment, into something far bigger than she could understand. And as Lucien took one step forward, the sound echoing softly across the marble, every eye turned to him, waiting, watching, because whatever happened next would change everything. The moment Lucien Voss stepped forward, the air shifted in a way Emily could feel in her bones, like pressure before a storm. invisible but undeniable, and every whisper in the hall died instantly, swallowed by something far more powerful than fear, something closer to obedience. He did not rush, did not speak. He simply walked, one measured step at a time across the polished marble, and somehow that was worse. Because every second stretched, every heartbeat dragged, every eye flicked between him and the human girl standing in chains as if the entire world had narrowed to a single decision waiting to happen. Emily forced herself to stand still even as her instincts screamed at her to run. But there was nowhere to go. Not here, not in a place that felt less like a room and more like a judgment. And when he finally stopped just a few feet away, she realized something that made her chest tighten. He was not looking at the council, not at the others, not at the power surrounding him. He was looking only at her. "You touched him." The same cold voice from before cut through the silence again, sharper now, demanding, and Emily blinked, confused, because touched him sounded like a crime, like something deliberate, something dangerous, when all she had done was help. But before she could say anything, another voice rose, layered with authority and something older. The bond was triggered, and that word, bond, moved through the crowd like a spark, igniting reactions she did not understand, tension tightening, bodies going still, attention sharpening. Emily swallowed, her mind racing. Bond meant connection, something shared. But how could that be possible when she had known him for less than a minute in a dark alley, when all she had offered was warmth and a simple act of kindness? And yet as she looked at him now, really looked, she noticed it, a faint mark along his wrist, barely visible beneath the cuff of his sleeve, glowing softly, almost like light trapped under skin, and something deep in her chest responded, not pain, not fear, something quieter, something that felt like recognition. "It is forbidden," the council voice declared, final, absolute. No king binds himself to a human. And this time there was no mistaking the meaning, no room for confusion, because every gaze in the hall turned colder, heavier, more certain, as if her fate had just been written in words older than anything she could comprehend. And Emily felt it then, the weight of something she had never agreed to, something she had never even known existed, pressing down on her shoulders. For a moment, she thought he would agree, that he would nod, step back, let the system correct itself, because everything about him spoke of control, of discipline, of someone who had lived by rules long before she was even born. And why would someone like him risk everything for someone like her, a waitress with nothing, no power, no place in this world, no reason to matter? But then he moved again, not away, not back, but closer, close enough that she could see the subtle shift in his expression, the way his gaze softened just slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if something inside him was being weighed and measured in real time. "Say it." The council pressed, tension snapping tight again. "Deny the bond." And the silence that followed felt louder than anything that had come before, stretching long enough for doubt to creep in, for fear to settle deeper, for Emily to realize that whatever he said next would decide everything, not just for her, but for him as well. Her hands trembled slightly against the cold metal at her wrists, but she did not look away, could not look away, because something in his eyes held her there. Something steady, something unwavering. And for the first time since being dragged into that hall, she felt something unexpected rise beneath the fear, something fragile but real, the possibility that she was not entirely alone in this. The council shifted, impatience building, the room holding its breath as if even the walls were waiting. And then finally, Lucien spoke, his voice low but carrying effortlessly through the space, calm, controlled, and completely unyielding. "No." And the word landed like a fracture through everything they believed was unbreakable, subtle but absolute. And the reaction was immediate, not chaos, not noise, but something far more dangerous, a silence filled with shock, with disbelief, with the quiet understanding that a line had just been crossed. Emily felt it before she fully understood it, the shift in the room, the way the air grew heavier, the way the eyes around her changed, no longer just observing, but calculating, because this was no longer about a mistake, no longer about a human in the wrong place. This had become something else entirely, something that could not be undone. And as Lucien took another step forward, placing himself fully between her and The council, the truth settled in with a clarity that made her breath catch. Whatever this bond was, whatever had begun in that alley, it had just become real, and it was about to cost far more than either of them had expected. The silence after his refusal did not break. It deepened, thick and suffocating, like the entire hall had been sealed off from the rest of the world, and Emily felt it press against her chest, as if even breathing had become something forbidden. No one moved, no one spoke, but the shift was unmistakable. The balance of power had tilted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that every being in that room understood without needing a single word. And at the center of it stood Lucien, unmoved, unshaken, as though defying centuries of law was nothing more than a choice he had already made long before this moment. You would risk everything. The council's voice returned, quieter now, but far more dangerous, stripped of authority and edged with something colder, something calculating, for a human. And the word human was not spoken with anger, but with dismissal, as if it carried no weight, no value, nothing worth consideration, and Emily felt it land against her like a truth she had lived her entire life, being overlooked, underestimated, treated as if she existed on the edges of everything important. But this time something was different, because he did not step away from her, did not correct them, did not deny what she was. Instead, he remained exactly where he stood, between her and them, a barrier she did not understand but could not ignore. Her pulse pounded, fast and uneven, as her mind struggled to catch up, because none of this made sense. Not the bond, not the way the room reacted, not the way he looked at her like she mattered in a place where she clearly did not belong. And yet there it was again, that faint pull in her chest, subtle but persistent, like a thread connecting them in ways she could not see but could feel, growing stronger with every second he refused to let go. This is not a question of preference. Another voice joined, colder, sharper, stepping forward from the shadows. This is law. And the word echoed, not just spoken but enforced, layered with history, with something ancient enough to feel unbreakable. And Emily realized then that this was not just about her, not just about him. It was about something far larger, something built long before either of them, something that did not bend easily. If at all, she should have been terrified, and part of her was. But another part, quieter and steadier, began to rise beneath the fear. Because for the first time in her life, someone was not stepping back, not choosing safety over her existence. And that alone felt more dangerous than anything else in that room. Lucien's gaze never left her, even as the pressure around them intensified, as if the entire hall was closing in, waiting for him to correct what they saw as a mistake, waiting for him to return to what he was supposed to be. But he did not move, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was calm, controlled, but carrying something deeper, something that made even the council hesitate. Then your law is flawed. And the words did not rise, did not challenge, they simply existed, undeniable and absolute. And that was what made them dangerous. A ripple moved through the room, not chaos, not outrage, but something quieter, something more uncertain, because this was not how this was supposed to go. This was not how power behaved. And yet here he was, rewriting it without raising his voice, without breaking composure, as if the system itself was nothing more than something he could choose to accept or reject. Emily felt her breath catch as the weight of what he had just done settled in, because this was no longer about whether she would be allowed to leave. This was no longer about a mistake in an alley or a misunderstanding in a hall. This had become something irreversible, something that could not be undone by simply stepping back or apologizing. And the realization hit her slowly but completely. Whatever connected them was not fading. It was solidifying, becoming real in a way that the world around them could not ignore. The council did not respond immediately, and somehow that silence felt louder than any argument, because it meant they were thinking, recalculating, adjusting to something they had not anticipated. And that was when Emily noticed it, the subtle shift in their attention, no longer fixed entirely on him, but on her as well, not with curiosity, not with interest, but with something colder, something more dangerous, as if she had gone from being irrelevant to being a problem that needed to be understood and possibly removed. Her fingers tightened slightly against the chains, not in panic, but in awareness, because she could feel it now. The change, The way the room no longer saw her as invisible, and that frightened her more than anything else, because invisibility had always been her protection, her shield, and without it, she had nothing except the one thing she could not explain, the one thing standing directly in front of her, refusing to let the world take her back. And as Lucien finally turned his gaze from her to the council, just for a moment, his expression unreadable but his presence unwavering, Emily understood something with a clarity that made her chest tighten. This was not the end of what had started in that alley. It was only the beginning, and whatever came next would not just test him, it would test her as well. In ways she was not ready for, in a world she did not belong to, tied to a man who had just chosen her over everything, and might be forced to prove it again. The shift in the room did not fade. It sharpened, like a blade being slowly drawn, invisible but unmistakably present, and Emily felt it in the way every gaze lingered just a second longer on her now, no longer dismissive, no longer indifferent, but measuring, calculating, as if her existence had suddenly become something that required attention, something that could not be ignored. She stood there, still bound, still out of place, yet no longer invisible, and that change alone felt more dangerous than the chains around her wrists, because invisibility had always been her shield, the quiet protection of being overlooked, but now she had been seen, truly seen, by the most powerful figure in the room, and by extension, by everyone else. Lucien did not step back, did not soften his stance, his presence remaining steady, deliberate, like a force that refused to be moved. And when he finally turned fully toward the council, the motion was slow, controlled, carrying a weight that silenced even the faintest whisper before it could form. "Release her," he said, and the command was not raised, not forced. It simply existed, absolute and undeniable, and for a fraction of a second, Emily thought it would happen, that the chains would fall away, that this would end as quickly as it began. But nothing moved, no one obeyed, and the stillness that followed was different this time, heavier, resistant. "You overstep," the council responded, the voice colder now, stripped of any pretense of neutrality, and for the first time, Emily sensed something she had not expected to feel from beings like them. Hesitation, not fear, but something close, because this was no longer a simple matter of enforcing rules. This had become a conflict between authority and something deeper, something more personal. Lucien's expression did not change, but something in the air around him shifted, subtle yet powerful, like pressure building beneath the surface of calm water. And when he spoke again, it was quieter, yet somehow more commanding. "I do not repeat myself." And that was when it happened, the faint sound of metal loosening, the chains around Emily's wrists giving just enough to remind her they were not as unbreakable as they had seemed moments ago. Her breath caught, not in relief, but in disbelief, because she could feel it now, the line being crossed in real time. The invisible boundary between what was allowed and what was not being rewritten with every second he refused to yield. The council did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched, tense and fragile, as if the entire structure of power in that room was being tested, pushed to a point it had not reached in a very long time. And then one of them stepped forward, not closer to Emily, but toward Lucien, a subtle shift that carried more meaning than any words could. "If you do this," the voice said slowly, deliberately, "there will be consequences." And the word lingered, heavy with implication, with promises that did not need to be spoken aloud. Emily felt a chill run through her, not from the cold, but from the realization that whatever came next would not be contained within this room, that this was only the beginning of something much larger, something that would follow them beyond these walls, into a world she barely understood. She glanced at Lucien, just for a second, searching for something, doubt, hesitation, anything that suggested he might reconsider. But there was none, only that same steady resolve, that same unwavering certainty that had carried him this far. And in that moment, something inside her shifted as well, a quiet recognition that whatever bound them was not one-sided, not something he alone was choosing, but something she was already part of, whether she understood it or not. The chains loosened further, the metal sliding just enough for her to feel the difference, and the room reacted, not loudly, but in a way that spoke volumes. A subtle tightening, a collective awareness that something irreversible was happening, that a decision had been made that could not be undone. Lucien stepped closer, close enough now that the space between them felt charged, alive with something unspoken, and when his hand lifted slightly, not touching, not quite, but close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his skin, Emily realized how real this had become, how far it had moved from a simple act of kindness in a dark alley to a moment that could reshape everything. "You will not decide her fate," he said, not to the room, not to any one voice, but to the system itself. And the words settled into the space like a truth that refused to be denied. The council did not answer, not immediately, and that silence was different from before, heavier, more uncertain, as if even they needed time to understand what had just been set in motion. And in that pause, Emily felt the last restraint give way, the chains around her wrists finally loosening enough to fall away, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a quiet finality that echoed louder than any declaration. Her hands were free, but the weight of the moment remained, pressing in from all sides, because freedom here did not mean safety. It meant something else entirely, something far more complicated. And as she stood there, no longer bound yet more exposed than ever, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was not the end of her being judged. It was only the moment she became impossible to ignore. And whatever came next would not just test the man who had chosen her. It would test whether she was strong enough to stand in a world that had never been meant for someone like her. The moment the chains slipped from her wrists, the room did not relax. It tightened, as if freedom itself had become the most dangerous act of all, and Emily felt it immediately, the weight of every gaze sharpening, focusing, no longer questioning whether she belonged here, but what she would do now that she stood unbound in a place that had never allowed someone like her to stand at all. Her hands hovered in front of her for a second, uncertain, as if she did not fully trust that she could move them, that this was real and not some fragile illusion that could shatter with the wrong breath. And when she finally lowered them slowly to her sides, the sound of her own heartbeat seemed louder than anything else in the vast hall. Lucien remained exactly where he was, close enough that she could feel the cold presence of him beside her, steady and unyielding. And for the first time since this began, Emily realized something that made her chest tighten in a different way. He had not just protected her. He had placed her at the center of something far larger than either of them could ignore, and there was no stepping back from that. "You misunderstand what you have done." The council's voice returned, no longer raised, no longer sharp, but layered with something far more controlled, more deliberate, and somehow more dangerous, as if they had moved past reaction and into calculation. "This is not defiance, this is disruption." And the word lingered, heavy with meaning, because disruption did not end quickly. It spread, it grew, it changed things in ways that could not be predicted or easily contained. Emily swallowed, her throat tight, because she could feel it now, not just in the room, but inside herself, that faint connection pulling at her awareness, subtle but constant, like a thread that refused to break. And when she risked a glance at Lucien, she saw it mirrored there, not as confusion, not as uncertainty, but as something he recognized, something he understood far better than she did. "Explain it," one of them demanded, stepping forward just enough to draw the focus again. And for a brief moment, Emily thought they were speaking to him, demanding justification, demanding reason, but then she realized. The attention had shifted again, not fully away from Lucien, but not entirely on him either. They were watching her, waiting, as if she held a piece of something they needed to see, something they could not access without her. The realization sent a ripple of unease through her, because she had nothing to give them, no answers, no hidden knowledge, only the memory of a rainy alley and a decision she had made without thinking. And yet the way they watched her suggested that was exactly what mattered, not what she knew, but what she had done. Lucien's voice cut through the tension before it could build further, calm, precise, and final. "There is nothing to explain," and the certainty in his tone left no space for argument. But the council did not retreat, did not accept it, because this was no longer about a simple violation. This was about something they did not control, and that was something they could not ignore. "A bond does not form without cause," the voice replied, measured and cold. And cause can be studied, understood, and corrected. And the last word settled heavily, not spoken as a threat, but as a certainty, and Emily felt it then, the shift in meaning, the subtle but unmistakable implication that whatever connected her to Lucien was not something they would simply accept, but something they would try to define, to limit, to reshape into something that fit their rules. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, not in fear, but in instinct, because for the first time she understood that she was not just a participant in this moment. She was the unknown variable, the part of the equation that did not belong, and that made her dangerous in a way she had never been before. Lucien did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched, deliberate, controlled, as if he was allowing the weight of their words to settle before choosing his own. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but carried a clarity that cut through everything else. "You will not study her." And there was something different in those words, not just authority, but protection, something personal layered beneath the command, something that made the tension in the room shift again, sharper this time, more focused. The council did not move, but the air seemed to tighten further, as if the space itself was reacting to the lines being drawn, to the boundaries being redefined in real time. And Emily felt her breath slow, not because the situation had eased, but because something inside her was beginning to settle, to align with the reality of where she stood now, not as a mistake, not as an outsider waiting to be removed, but as something that had already changed the rules simply by existing within them. She did not understand the bond, did not understand why it had formed or what it meant, but she understood one thing with growing clarity: it was not something that could be undone by denial or erased by force. And the way Lucien stood beside her, unwavering, only confirmed it. The silence returned again, heavier than before, but no longer empty, filled instead with unspoken decisions, with calculations that stretched beyond this room, beyond this moment. And as Emily stood there, free but exposed, connected to a world she had never chosen, she realized that whatever came next would not just define her place here, it would define what this bond truly was, and whether it would become something they could control or something that would change everything. The silence did not break, it transformed, settling into something colder, more deliberate, as if the entire hall had shifted from reaction into strategy, and Emily could feel it in the way no one rushed to speak, no one moved without purpose. Every presence now calculating rather than judging, as if she had become a problem too complex for simple answers. Her breath steadied slowly, not because she felt safe, but because something inside her refused to collapse under the weight of it all. And for the first time she noticed how different everything felt compared to the moment she had been dragged in. The fear was still there, sharp and real, but it was no longer the only thing holding her in place. There was something else now, something quieter but stronger, the awareness that she was no longer invisible, and that meant she had a role in whatever came next, whether she wanted it or not. Lucien remained beside her, unmoving, but the space around him seemed to carry a gravity of its own, as if the room itself adjusted to his presence. And when he finally spoke again, it was not to argue, not to defend, but to define. "This ends here," he said, and the words were calm, controlled, yet carried a finality that suggested he had already decided what the next step would be. The council did not respond immediately, and that hesitation, that brief pause, revealed more than any open disagreement could have, because it meant they were considering, weighing outcomes, recognizing that whatever they chose now would ripple far beyond this moment. Emily felt a subtle shift in the air again, not tension exactly, but anticipation, as if something was about to change, something that would move this from a confrontation into something far more permanent. "You intend to remove her," one of them said finally, the words measured, almost neutral, but layered with implication, and Emily's chest tightened slightly, because remove her did not sound like protection, it sounded like relocation. Like being taken out of one situation only to be placed into another. She did not understand. Lucien did not deny it, did not soften the statement. He simply answered, "She leaves with me." And this time there was no resistance in his tone, no edge of defiance, only certainty, as if the decision had already been made long before this conversation began. A ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, because this was not just a choice, it was a declaration, one that carried consequences none of them could ignore, and Emily felt it in the way the eyes around her shifted again, no longer just assessing her, but reassessing him as well, recalculating where he stood in relation to the system he had just challenged. And if we refuse, the council pressed, not as a threat, but as a question that needed to be answered, and for a moment, the air seemed to still completely, as if even the space between them was waiting for what would come next. Lucien did not raise his voice, did not change his posture, but something in the atmosphere tightened, subtle yet unmistakable, like a line being drawn that could not be crossed without consequence. "You will not," he said, and the simplicity of it made it heavier, because it was not a demand, it was a fact, something he believed so completely that it left no room for doubt. Emily's breath caught slightly as she realized what that meant, not just for her, but for him, because this was no longer about a single decision in a single moment. This was about a path he was choosing to walk, one that would place him at odds with everything around him, and the weight of that choice settled in slowly, almost quietly, making her chest tighten in a way she could not fully explain. The council fell silent again, but this time it was different, less resistant, more contemplative, as if they were seeing something they had not expected, something that forced them to reconsider their approach. And when they finally spoke, their voice had shifted, not softer, but more precise. "Then understand this," they said. "If she leaves this hall, she does not leave unchanged." And the words lingered, carrying a meaning that reached beyond the obvious, beyond the physical, touching something deeper, something tied to the bond itself. Emily felt it immediately, the faint pull in her chest responding, tightening slightly, as if reacting to the idea, and she realized with a quiet clarity that whatever connected her to Lucien was not something that could remain hidden, not something that could be ignored once she stepped beyond these walls. It would follow her, shape her, change her in ways she did not yet understand. Lucien did not respond to the warning, but his presence did not waver, and that alone was enough to signal that he had already accepted whatever came with this choice, that the consequences had been considered and dismissed in favor of something else, something stronger. The tension in the room eased just slightly, not disappearing, but shifting into something more controlled, more contained, as if a temporary resolution had been reached, and Emily felt the weight of it settle over her, not relief, but a transition, the sense that this moment was ending and something else was about to begin. She glanced once more at the hall, at the figures who had judged her, measured her, nearly decided her fate without ever knowing her, and then back at Lucien, the one person who had stepped forward instead of back. And in that quiet space between what had been and what was coming, she understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Leaving this place would not mean escaping it. It would mean carrying it with her, along with everything that had just been set in motion, and whatever waited beyond these walls would not be simpler. It would be more dangerous, more uncertain, and far more real. The decision settled over the hall like a quiet storm, not loud, not explosive, but undeniable in its presence, and Emily felt it in the way no one stepped forward to stop them. No one spoke to challenge what had just been agreed without being spoken aloud. The council had not given permission, not truly, but they had not refused either, and in a place built on absolute rules, that hesitation was everything. Lucien turned slightly, not away from the room, but toward the path that had opened behind him, and for a moment, Emily did not move, her body still catching up to the reality that she was about to walk out of a place she should never have entered, carrying something she did not understand and could not leave behind. "Come," he said, the word quiet, not a command, not a demand, but something steadier, something that assumed she would choose to follow, and that alone made her chest tighten, because no one had ever spoken to her like that before, not as if her choice mattered, not as if she had a place beside them rather than beneath. Her feet hesitated for only a second before she stepped forward, the sound of her shoes against the marble echoing softly in the vast space, each step feeling heavier than the last, not from fear, but from the awareness that every movement was being watched, measured, remembered. As she passed the line where the council stood, the air felt different, colder, sharper, and she could feel their attention shift again, not blocking her, not stopping her, but marking her, as if committing her presence to memory in a way that would not fade. Once she was gone, she did not look at them, did not allow herself to meet those eyes again, because she understood now that this was not over, that leaving this hall did not mean leaving their reach. The doors ahead were tall, impossibly so, stretching upward like something carved for beings far greater than her. And as they began to open, slow and silent, the outside air pressed in, carrying a different kind of cold, one that felt less controlled, less contained, like stepping out of a cage. Only to realize the world beyond was just as uncertain. She crossed the threshold beside him, and the moment her foot touched the stone beyond the hall, something shifted inside her, subtle but undeniable. The faint connection in her chest tightening, as if responding to the change in space, in boundaries, in reality itself. She inhaled sharply, not from pain, but from the sudden awareness that whatever bound her to him was no longer contained within those walls. It had followed her out, expanded, settled deeper into something she could not ignore. Lucian paused just beyond the doorway, not looking back, not acknowledging the room they had left behind, as if it no longer held authority over what came next. And for a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to glance back, just once, and what she saw made her breath catch. The figures in the hall had not moved, but the stillness was different now, no longer neutral, no longer distant, but focused, intent, as if they were watching the beginning of something rather than the end. And she understood then that this moment would not fade. It would echo, it would spread, it would reach far beyond what she could see. She turned away quickly, forcing herself forward, because standing still was no longer an option, not when everything around her was shifting, not when the world she knew had already been left behind with a single step. Outside, the night stretched wide and endless, the sky darker than she had ever noticed before, the air sharper, clearer, and yet nothing about it felt familiar anymore, as if even the world she had lived in her entire life had changed the moment she crossed that threshold. "You should be afraid," Lucian said, suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet, not unkind, not harsh, but direct. And Emily let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it, because she was afraid. She had been afraid since the moment she stepped into that alley, since the moment she looked into eyes that did not belong to any world she understood. "I am," she admitted, her voice steady despite everything, and that seemed to matter, because he glanced at her then, just briefly, his expression unreadable, but his gaze sharper, more focused, as if assessing something beyond her words. "Good," he said after a moment, and there was something in that single word that made her chest tighten again, not from fear, but from the realization that fear here was not weakness, it was awareness, it was survival, it was the only thing keeping her grounded in a reality that no longer made sense. They moved forward together, away from the hall, away from the council, but not away from what had been set in motion, because Emily could feel it with every step, the bond, the attention, the shift in everything around them, growing stronger, more defined, as if the world itself was adjusting to their choice. And as the distance between them and the hall increased, one truth settled in with quiet certainty. Leaving had not ended anything. It had only made it real, and whatever waited ahead would not just challenge them. It would force them to prove whether what had begun between them was strong enough to survive in a world that had already decided it should not exist. The farther they moved from the hall, the quieter the world became. But it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind that followed something irreversible, the kind that settled in after a line had been crossed and could not be uncrossed. And Emily felt it with every step, not just around her, but inside her, that faint connection no longer subtle, no longer easy to ignore, now a steady presence beneath her heartbeat, like something awakening rather than fading. The path stretched ahead through towering stone corridors that seemed to belong to a different era, a different logic, and she realized with a slow, unsettling clarity that this place was not just a building. It was a world layered on top of the one she had known, hidden in plain sight, yet governed by rules she had never been meant to understand. Lucian walked beside her, his pace measured, controlled, as if nothing behind them mattered anymore. But there was something in the way his silence held, something deliberate, something that suggested he was not ignoring what had happened, but already calculating what came next. What does it mean? Emily asked finally, her voice quieter than she intended, not out of fear, but because the question felt heavier than it should have, as if the answer would change more than she was ready for. And for a moment he did not respond, his gaze fixed ahead, his expression unreadable, until he slowed slightly, just enough to acknowledge that the question could not be avoided. It means you are no longer unseen, he said, and the simplicity of the answer made it land harder than anything else, because she understood that. She had already felt it, the shift from invisible to unavoidable, from background to center, and that alone was enough to change everything. She let out a slow breath, trying to steady herself, but the question had not been answered, not really, and she knew it, felt it in the way the bond pulsed faintly again, reacting to something deeper than words. That is not what I meant, she said, a little stronger this time, forcing herself to meet his gaze as he finally looked at her, and for a second, something flickered there, not hesitation, but consideration, as if he was deciding how much truth she was ready to hear. It means you are tied to me, he said at last, and the words were not dramatic, not exaggerated. They were simply stated, but the impact was immediate, a tightening in her chest, a quiet confirmation of what she had already begun to suspect, and yet hearing it spoken made it real in a way she could not ignore. Tied how? She asked, because the word could mean anything, and right now, anything felt too big, too undefined, too dangerous, and this time his answer came without delay, in a way that cannot be undone by distance or denial, and something in his tone made it clear that this was not speculation, not theory, it was fact, something proven, something understood. Emily's steps slowed slightly, her mind racing, trying to piece together something that made sense, something that fit within the world she knew. But nothing did, because this was not a connection she had chosen, not something she had built over time. It had happened in a moment, in an instinct, in a decision she would have made again without thinking, and now it had become something permanent. So I just leave my life behind, she said, not accusing, not angry, but searching, because she needed to understand what this meant for her, not just for him. And for the first time, Lucien stopped, completely, turning to face her fully, his presence shifting in a way that made the air feel heavier, more focused. Your life has already changed, he said, not unkind, but direct, and there was no argument in it, no attempt to soften the truth, only clarity, and that was what made it harder to accept, because she knew he was right. She had felt it the moment she stepped out of that hall, the moment the bond followed her into the open air, the moment she realized there was no version of her life that continued as it had before. She looked away briefly, her thoughts pulling in different directions, fear and uncertainty clashing with something else she could not fully name, something quieter, something that felt almost like purpose, and that scared her more than anything else, because it meant a part of her was already adjusting, already stepping into something she did not understand. And if I do not want this, she asked, the question softer now, not because it was less important, but because it felt more honest, and for a moment, there was no answer, only silence, and in that silence, she saw it, not in his words, but in his expression, the truth he was not avoiding but also not rushing to say, because it was not simple, it was not easy. It will not matter, he said finally, and there was no cruelty in it, no indifference, only reality, and that was what made it settle so deeply, because it meant this was not about choice anymore, not in the way she understood it. This was about consequence, about something set in motion that neither of them could stop. The bond pulsed again, stronger this time, and Emily felt it clearly, not as something forced, not as something imposed, but as something that existed regardless of what she wanted, something that connected them in a way that was already real. She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time, she understood the weight of what he had done back in that hall, not just choosing her, but choosing everything that came with her, the uncertainty, the risk, the unknown, and that realization shifted something inside her, not removing the fear, but reshaping it into something steadier, something that did not run, did not hide, but stayed. The corridor opened ahead into a wider space, darker, quieter, the night air slipping in through tall windows, and as they stepped forward together, Emily understood one thing with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was no longer about escaping what had happened. It was about facing what it had created, and whatever waited ahead would not give them the option to turn back. Only the choice of how far they were willing to go to protect something that should never have existed, but now could not be undone. The space ahead opened into a wide terrace carved from dark stone, overlooking a city that should have felt familiar but no longer did, its lights stretching for miles like a reminder of a life that now felt impossibly distant. And Emily stepped forward slowly, the cool night air brushing against her skin in a way that felt sharper than before, as if every sensation had been heightened, every detail pulled into focus by something she could not name but could not ignore. She stopped near the edge, her hands resting lightly against the cold railing. And for a moment she simply looked, trying to find something recognizable in the endless grid of streets and buildings, something that told her she still belonged somewhere in that world. But the longer she stared, the more it felt like she was already standing outside of it, separated by something deeper than distance. Lucien remained a few steps behind her at first, not approaching, not speaking, as if allowing the silence to settle into something she could process, something she could choose to fill or leave untouched. And for the first time since everything had begun, Emily realized that the quiet was not empty. It was heavy with everything that had not been said, everything that still needed to be faced. "If I walk away now," she said finally, her voice steady but quieter than the wind moving through the terrace, "does any of this follow me?" And the question lingered, not just between them, but within her, because she already suspected the answer. She had felt it since the moment she crossed that threshold, but hearing it would make it real in a way she could not take back. Lucien stepped closer then, his presence shifting into her space without overwhelming it, controlled, deliberate, and when he answered, his voice carried that same calm certainty that had defined every decision he had made so far. Yes, and the simplicity of it left no room for interpretation, no space for hope that this could be undone by distance or denial. Emily let out a slow breath, her gaze still fixed on the city, because she needed that moment, needed the illusion of something normal, even if it no longer applied. And as the silence stretched again, something inside her settled, not into acceptance, not yet, but into clarity, because she understood now that this was not about whether she wanted this. It was about what she would do with it. She turned then, slowly, facing him fully, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with something unspoken but undeniable. The bond pulsing faintly again, stronger now, more defined, as if responding to the choice forming in her mind. "Then I guess walking away is not really an option," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, no anger, only honesty, and that seemed to matter, because something in his expression shifted slightly, not relief, not satisfaction, but recognition, as if he had been waiting for her to reach that conclusion on her own. "No," he replied quietly, and for the first time, the word did not feel like a limitation. It felt like a starting point. Emily nodded once, more to herself than to him, because the decision was not about him, not entirely. It was about her, about whether she would stand in this reality or try to pretend it did not exist, and pretending had never been something she was good at, not when things mattered. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the distant hum of the city below, and she took one last look at it, at the life she had known, the one defined by long shifts and small spaces and quiet struggles that no one else noticed, and she realized something that surprised her. She did not miss it the way she thought she would, not because it had not mattered, but because it had never seen her the way this moment did. She turned back to Lucien, her shoulders straightening just slightly, not out of confidence, but out of decision, and when she spoke again, her voice was steadier, clearer. "Then you are going to have to tell me everything." And the words carried more than curiosity, they carried intent, because she was no longer asking what this meant. She was stepping into it, choosing to understand rather than retreat. Lucien held her gaze for a moment longer, and in that silence, something shifted again, not in the world around them, but between them, a quiet alignment, as if the bond had moved from something accidental to something acknowledged, something they were both aware of now in a way that could not be ignored. "I will," he said, and the promise was not dramatic, not exaggerated. It was simple, but it carried weight, because it meant this was no longer just about survival. It was about truth, about everything that had been hidden now coming into the open. Emily exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest easing just slightly, not because things were resolved, but because they were no longer undefined, and that alone made the unknown feel more manageable, even if it was still dangerous. The city lights flickered in the distance, steady and indifferent, and as the night stretched on around them, Emily understood one thing with a clarity that felt almost quiet in its certainty. This was not the end of her story. It was the moment it truly began, not as the girl who had been overlooked, but as someone who had stepped into a world that had tried to reject her and refused to leave, and whatever came next would not just test the strength of the bond between them. It would reveal whether something that was never meant to exist could become something powerful enough to change everything.